along, just type them in and I'll pause and answer your questions as I'm going along. What I'm going to do first in the seminar today is talk about what the examiners have been saying about text responses and Farewell to Arms specifically, and then I'm going to go on to talk about the characters, the themes and the symbols. Okay. So one of the things that hi Sam, sorry, I've just given you a whole preamble that wasn't being recorded. Let me just go back to the beginning. So what I'm going to do today is, first of all, I'm going to talk about what the examiners are saying about text responses and about Farewell to Arms specifically. And then I'm going to talk about characters and themes and symbols. If you've got any questions throughout the presentation, just type them in and I'll do my best to answer them, okay? One of the things that examiners have been saying about text responses, certainly last year, is that many students use the most obvious scenes from a text. So they have learned, a couple of key scenes and are using those key scenes to write their entire response. However, the high scoring responses, that is the responses that had the most discerning and interesting things to say, showed that they had an understanding of the whole text and that they had an in-depth understanding of what happened where and some interesting insights to offer that those minor scenes gave them. Examiners also talked about how the construction of a text adds to its meaning and understanding. So these are typically in a text response in the exams, you'll have a question that's sort of about themes and characters and a question that's about how do we know this. So if you're given a how question, you'd be talking about first person narration. You would be talking about the fact that A Farewell to Arms is constructed in 5 parts, like a typical tragedy. So these are some of the things that you need to have a good understanding of to understand how the construction adds meaning, okay? You should also be encouraged to think skeptically about the things I have to say and the things that your teacher has to say, and certainly the things that NEEP and the Insight Guides have to say. Not that these things don't offer terrific insight, but you should trust your own judgment about your reading of a character. So for instance, there are some things that Insight or NEEP Guides say that I don't necessarily agree with. That doesn't mean that either one of us is wrong, but that interpretations of a text are individual and you should trust your own judgment when you're interpreting characters and themes and so on. So keep in mind that almost every student who studies the text that you're doing in Farewell to Arms will have read the Insight and the NEEP Guide to Farewell to Arms, and if you're just reproducing that sort of information, you're going to be producing a fairly generic essay unless you're an absolutely fabulously articulated English student. So if you want to have a point of differentiation, try not to rely too much on that commercially produced material. The other thing that you should look at is you don't have to agree with the topic. You are allowed to disagree with the topic and disagree with words within the topic. So the words of a topic will offer you an interpretation. Like last year, there was a question about that the text feels as fresh as if it had just been written, and I certainly don't agree with that, mostly because of the archaic way that that Hemingway thinks of women and all of those sorts of things. So you could write an essay that looked critically about the assumptions that the topic is making. The other thing that you need to look at is that you explore all elements presented in the topic. So if you're talking about the love between Catherine and Henry is an escape from the horrors of war, you're not just talking about how the love is explored in the text, but you're also looking at how the horrors of war are explored within the text. And typically students will just look at one half or another half of a text response rather than looking at the whole of the text response and exploring both of those. Okay, so a really good response will have both halves explored. So here we can see what happened last year, to what extent is love an escape from the horrors of war in A Farewell to Arms. So students tended to talk about the love that Catherine and Henry had and how it's an escape, but didn't discuss the horrors of war, which of course aren't very graphic in Farewell to Arms. It's all sort of behind the scenes. So you really need to explore how the horrors of war are explored behind the scenes. Although Frederick, and the second question was, although Frederick Henry retells the events many years later, there is still a strong sense of immediacy in the narration. How is this achieved? One of the things that you really need to talk about, first of all, is that although we're hearing the narration of Frederick Henry, it is Hemingway who is, of course, writing this. So you need to be critical of the fact that this topic assumes that Frederick Henry is a real person or a real character, not a figment of Hemingway's imagination. So you need to keep that in mind. I was talking earlier about being critical of the topics. This is something you need to be critical of. And then you need to have an idea of how, because it's in first-person narration, that makes things seem more immediate and realer than if it was in a third-person narration, and all of those sorts of things. So you might agree with some aspects of the topic but disagree with others. Okay? So that was the exam last year. I'm going to now move on to a discussion of the text itself, and I'm going to start with a discussion of the characters. Oh, sorry, I'm not. I'm going to start with a discussion of the structure. The reason I'm starting with a discussion of the structure is because sometimes Farewell to Arms can be difficult to follow. The descriptions are fairly generic, and it's sometimes hard to understand what happens where. So looking at Farewell to Arms from a structuralist perspective gives us a really good understanding about what's happening where. So Farewell to Arms is a 5-act tragedy like Romeo and Juliet or Hamlet or many Shakespearean tragedies or Greek tragedies for that matter. And typically what happens in a 5-act tragedy is that you have Act 1, which is the orientation, the background information, so just sort of setting the scene, if you will. Act 2 gives you the rising action, and the basic conflict is introduced. So what's going to be the problem that the characters have to deal with? That's going to happen in Act 2. Act 3 is the climax, so it's the turning point of the protagonist's life when they decide on their action. They make their choices. Act 4, we have the falling action, so we can see what the conclusion is going to be from the action, from the choice that the characters have made, and we're going to head towards tragedy. And in Act 5, we have what's called formally the denouement, which is that that tragedy is met and the tension is ended. So even though we know it's going to go towards a tragedy, because we've got lots of foreboding of this, it's in Act 5 that the actual tension of, oh my God, when's it going to happen, how is it going to happen, is resolved. So this is the structure that, that Hemingway follows for Farewell to Arms. And we'll see it here, because we start with Book 1, and in Book 1, Hemingway sets the scene of a very meaningless war that's made even more meaningless by drunken soldiers who seem to have no interest in the war, who just go on getting drunk and sleeping with prostitutes and all of those sorts of things, and we can see the inherent pointlessness of war. It is in Act 1 that Henry is injured, and also in, not Act 1, Book 1, that Henry is injured, and also in Book 1 that he meets Catherine. So we've sort of introduced all of the main characters, and we've introduced the plot device, the injury of Henry's, that sees him in more contact with Catherine. In Book 2, this is the conflict. It's summer. This is where most of the romance between Henry and Catherine plays out. And the war is very much outside of this. Of course, in Book 2, this is where the conflict comes in and Catherine finds that she is pregnant. at the very end of book 2. So we see that that's the conflict that the characters are going to have to overcome. In book 3, the character has to make a choice. So this is the climax. Henry returns to the war. He's increasingly pessimistic about the war. His unit starts to retreat. Henry's life is in danger for desertion of the army, and he ultimately decides to run away from the army, to desert the army, and to reunite with Catherine. So that's his choice. Book 4, The Falling Action. This is where Henry and Catherine flee to Switzerland, and they've met in Stresa, and they've spent a couple of days there, and we can see them moving towards a life as sort of outsiders and preparing for the baby's arrival. And this sense that, that they need to run away and start another life. Okay, and then in book 5, it's winter. There's an increased sense of foreboding, and then we know increasingly bad things are going to happen, and they are, of course, separate from the world, which signals that ultimate separation from the physical world for Catherine. So ultimately she dies, of course, so that's the tragic ending. So that's what happens in each book, and that's why, if you have a how question about how the novel is structured, these are the sorts of things that you need to talk about. How, different books have rising action, falling action, climax, denouement, those sorts of things. Those kinds of language will help you discuss that more. And it will also help you, hopefully, orient yourself around what you're doing. Now I'm going to move on to the characters. There are a lot of characters in A Farewell to Arms, and students typically talk about Catherine and Henry, of course, because they're the main characters, but they're not the only characters that you need to discuss. A really high-scoring response will have an understanding of how each of the minor characters contributes to our understanding of the major characters. But we will, of course, start with the major characters. So, Frederick Henry, who is the, I say hero in quotation marks, because he's very much an anti-hero, really. He is drunk all the time, he's not very admirable, he's pessimistic, he's not loyal. We see him quite critically, and I think this is perhaps because he describes himself quite critically. He's a man who doesn't seem to have, much going for him. He's got a very negative view of the world and of his importance in it. At the beginning, he treats Catherine, of course, very lightly, and forgets to keep romancing her or seducing her. And he's joined an army which has nothing to do with him, only because he speaks Italian. So again, his whole life seems to me ridiculous, and his choices are based on sort of around ridiculous reasons, because life is pointless. But it also gives him a sense of self. Like in the war, he can see he's got a uniform, he knows who he is. And in civilian clothes, of course, he feels a masquerader. He feels like he's not the real person. Henry seems to move from one existential crisis to another. So at the beginning, he's not quite sure why he's making the decisions. He's not quite sure why he's in the war. Then in book 2, he sort of is seducing Catherine, and then he falls in love with her, but he didn't quite mean to fall in love with her. And then he starts to enjoy himself, but then he finds out she's pregnant, so that's another crisis. And then he goes back to the war and he thinks, oh, this war is pointless, so then he leaves. So, he's never quite happy with the way things are. He always thinks there should be something more, while at the same time kind of recognising that there is nothing more. He is a character, of course, who has much spiritual emptiness, which is characterised by his physical emptiness. He's often eating to fill a hollowness. He's hungry when things go wrong, and he drinks to get some kind of oblivion from the life that he sees around him. So for Henry, food is very much a symbol of trying to fill this void. And whenever things go wrong, in times of crisis, he's eating. Like when he's blown up, he's eating cheese. When when he deserts the army, he feels hungry when he's lying under the tarp in the back of a truck. When Catherine's in labour, of course, he's going out to eat constantly because it's like he's trying to fill this spiritual void within him. Catherine is the heroine of the novel, and the heroine that most students seem to love to hate. We see her as kind of a very passive creature who, you know, wants to sort of get rid of herself, you know, just become the object of love without having any real personality of her own. It's important, if you have that interpretation of Catherine, to recognise that we're only seeing Henry's point of view. I think the novel would play out entirely different if Catherine were writing her own story. But we're always seeing her from Henry's point of view. And of course, we know that Henry is a very selfish and self-involved character who's only interested in his own existential crises and doesn't seem to have much interest in the people around him. Like when Amo dies, he says, "Oh, I liked him as much as anyone." You know, he's not particularly curious about people around him. Yeah, he's very self-involved. So, you know, we see as Catherine as being very unlikable, but perhaps that's because we're seeing Henry's point of view, not Catherine's point of view. The symbol of her hair I will come back to later because I think this is a really important symbol for Catherine and what she represents for Henry. Catherine is often asking Henry to have, you know, to reaffirm his love for her, and in that way I guess she looks needy. But there's a point which, when they're making love earlier on in the novel, that she's saying, you know, "Do you love me? Do you love me?" And he says yes, even though he's lying. And then she says, "Oh no, that's all over now. I don't need to do that anymore." So she's playing the game too, even though Henry's saying he's playing the game, and it's almost as like, you know, Catherine's unaware of it. She is aware of it. You know, she wants Henry to say that he loves her, but she's also aware that you know, that he doesn't, and that they're just both playing a game. They're both trying to fill a void within themselves, and so she's using him as much as he's using her, because she's using him to escape from the fact that she didn't sleep with her fiancé who died, and so she feels terribly guilty about that. So she's using Henry to assuage her guilt. We have to infer most of what Catherine's thinking because Henry doesn't tell us what she's thinking, and we can really see how inferential this text is. You need to look at chapters like chapter 16, where it's a terribly short chapter and you might want to reread it. I remember talking to my students about this last year and talking about during that scene, she gives Henry an enema and then they have sex. And they said, "I don't remember that chapter at all," but that's what's happening in chapter 16. It's just that you have to read between the lines, and, you know, an occasional line in the dialogue will indicate that that's what's happening. Hemingway doesn't tell you everything. He lets you think for yourself, and we have to think for ourselves of what Catherine is thinking. You know, she's constantly saying, "I'm not afraid, I'm not afraid, people have babies all the time." Well, if she genuinely wasn't afraid, she probably wouldn't have to say that, but it's almost like she's trying to convince herself. So, you know, it's easy to see her as very unidimensional, but if you look more carefully at why she's saying the things that she's saying, you know, why is she talking about not being afraid? You know, perhaps she is afraid. Okay, so you have to infer a lot of what's going on. So think very critically about the character of Catherine. I've already talked a bit about her playing about being in love at the beginning. Catherine Barclay is contrasted to other women in the novel. She's sort of an ideal woman because, you know, she puts her own needs aside, her own desires aside for her man. And we look particularly at her compared to Helen Ferguson, whom Henry regards with a fair bit of distaste because she has opinions, she's ugly, which is never a good thing for a woman, and she disapproves of Henry, and Henry doesn't like that feeling, particularly from a woman. So he sees Catherine as very much an ideal nurse. Nurse Gage is a bit similar to Catherine in many ways, and I'll come back to that later on. Rinaldi is very much the embodiment of what it is to be masculine. He's, you know, effusive in his emotions, but and he's got a great sense of self. By God, baby, I'm becoming a lovely surgeon. He's very confident. He's sort of full of beans. He drinks a lot. He womanizes all the time. And even though he's got the hots for Catherine to begin with, he quickly moves on from her. He doesn't actually have these untidy emotions for women. He thinks she's beautiful, but he doesn't become involved in the same way that Henry does. So we see Rinaldi as this fantastic masculine character who doesn't get too involved with women. And in this quote on page 153, we see this fantastic image of Rinaldi. I'm only happy when I'm working. I like only two other things. One is bad for my work, which would be drinking, and the other is over in half an hour or 15 minutes, which is sex. So clearly, Rinaldi embodies these three things that men should like: working, drinking, and sex. They're the important things. So he's much more masculine, I guess, than Henry is. Helen Ferguson is a very minor character, and Henry feels very, very critically of Ferguson, and of her ugliness, of the fact that she's so protective of Catherine, and all of these sorts of things. Like, protective is something that a man should be, not a woman should be. So he doesn't like her, and he doesn't like that she disapproves of him, as I said earlier. And one of the important things is that Ferguson says, "You'll die then, fight or die." That's what people do. And clearly Catherine gives up the will. She stops fighting. She goes along with Henry. She doesn't fight for her own identity. She just keeps sort of wanting to be subsumed by him. And of course, eventually she is subsumed by him and his child. In wanting to become sort of the perfect woman for Henry, she gives up on her own identity. And that's what Ferguson is sort of already indicating to us. The priest is a character who is only there in the beginning of the novel, but he helps us understand very much Henry's nihilistic or pessimistic attitude towards life. He says to the priest, "I couldn't understand why I didn't visit the family that you wanted me to visit, and we don't always do the things that we want to do." So even though the priest doesn't say much or have much to offer, the priest shows up Henry in a fairly negative way, and shows Henry to be fairly weak, drunkard. So instead of living up to principles that he might have, Henry just goes along with the people around him. And the priest, who goes against the grain of all of the soldiers around him, who does things differently, really is contrasted to Henry, who just goes along with things. Count Greffy we see only in the later book of, in book 4 of the novel. And he's sort of a bit older and wiser. He has moved beyond the existential crisis of what are we doing here, why are we here, into just, accepting that each day might be your last. He's had a long life and it's worth drinking champagne every day. And not worrying about the future, because this is what you've got. What you have now is in this moment. People live, people die. You need to just get on with enjoying yourself. So he's a really important character for understanding this view of life, that even though Greffy is sort of faced with the prospect of his own death each day, he just gets on with it. The medical staff we see in predominantly book 2 of the novel. Some of them pop up in other spots. Miss Van Kampen is, we don't like at all. She's, again, a fairly masculine woman in that she bosses Henry around. She disapproves of him drinking. She's sort of anti-fun, I guess, and Henry regards her very suspiciously. But I think he also regards her quite suspiciously because he thinks she's ugly, and she won't let him drink, and she doesn't approve of his friendships with the nurses. So, again, he judges her harshly because he feels judged by her. So we need to, again, look at, is Nurse Van Kampen that awful? Like, really, she's suggesting that he's drinking too much, which clearly he is. Is that just the worst thing in the world for a nurse to do? Well, yeah. So you need to think critically about how Henry regards her. Nurse Gage is... again, a very feminine character that we admire in the same way that Henry admires the that Henry admires Catherine. She seems to have some jealousy of Catherine, and considering there's a passage where he describes her doing something very skillfully for him, we're not told what that something very skillfully is, but the indication is that, she's somehow meeting one of his bodily needs. And again, we have to infer what that might be. That women are there to serve, to make sure that he's comfortable in every way. So, and she's a pretty nurse, of course, so we like that too. Nurse Walker is sort of, this nebulous character who is neither pretty nor ugly, and we therefore regard her with disdain. She's not one thing or the other, she's not important. Dr. Valentini is the doctor who operates on Henry, and he's contrasted with the other doctors who move around in a group. He's very masculine. He understands how important it is to drink, because he drinks even though he's doing his rounds, and he's very confident in his own ability to work miracles. So, Dr. Valentini is very much a man's man, and when I say we admire him, Henry admires him for what he embodies. He's an independent man of the world, so we really admire him. Henry, of course, works as an ambulance driver, and we see the other ambulance drivers that Henry associates with. In book 1, there's Passini, who has his legs blown off, and Gavuzzi, who survives, and Mera, who survives, and Gordini, who's injured. These are the men who are sitting around eating cheese with him when he's blown up. They talk about why they're there at the war, what they're looking forward to, how they want to get medals, and they're really exploring their masculinity in this particular passage. So these 4 men are terrific examples of how, they're sort of devil-may-care, but at the same time hungry and trying to eat to fill this void of their own fear, pretend that they're not afraid. There are other ambulance drivers in book 3. We have Bonello, who kills another soldier, and is terribly proud of himself because he's always wanted to kill someone. He's never had the opportunity to kill someone, so he's terribly proud of himself. We have Amo, who's killed during the retreat, and, Henry seems to be quite devoid of interest here, but he does say that, he liked him as much as he's liked anyone, so presumably he was quite fond of him, but it's almost understated, this feeling of friendship that he has for Amo. And Piani, who travels with Henry during the retreat, they eat apples together, they pick up the women that then they deliver to safety, all of these sorts of things. So these ambulance drivers are very much representative of the masculine view of the world. They have important conversations about what the war is for, and what it is to be a man. When Bonello kills another soldier, he's very much exploring, he's always wanted to kill someone, that's, a fundamental part of being a man with a capital M. There are other characters. These characters are in book 2, Mr. and Mrs. Myers, who seem to live the good life. They seem to be quite separate from the war, except that they take the soldiers out and try to entertain them and make each day count. So they're a bit like Count Greffy in the way that they have this sort of carpe diem, seize the day type attitude to life. They go to the races, they gamble, and of course we know that all life is a gamble in Henry's world. They eat well, they drink well, and they're terribly affectionate to the soldiers and, generally go on with enjoying life. We've also got Ettore, who, wants to get medals and is hoping that Henry will get medals for his bravery. And although Henry admires Ettore, he also thinks, he has no time for ideas like loyalty and bravery and valour. Those sorts of words make him uncomfortable. But I think that he admires a character like Ettore because he's comfortable with his own masculinity and his own understanding of these ideas. So they're the characters that you need to have an understanding of when you're writing this text. Of course, all of these minor characters that I've gone through just give us a better understanding of who Henry is and his own biases, not that they're well drawn out and we know very much about the characters at the end, but they sort of serve as reflections for our understanding of the character of Frederick Henry. So if we want to talk about Henry, we need to talk about these other characters and how his understanding of them shows us a lot about how he thinks. So now I'm going to move on to the themes, what they are and how I think about them, okay? So these are the themes that I see within the text. These will be similar to themes that you have talked about in class, probably, hopefully. I'm going to talk about them in more depth. But I want you to be aware that you shouldn't only talk about masculinity as masculinity, but what it is to be a man. You should do sort of a vocab search for all of these different themes, so you can talk about masculinity, for instance, in different ways, or you can talk about hopelessness. I've talked about Henry having a nihilistic view of the world, or existential crises. These are all connected with this idea of hopelessness. So a good Google search with thesaurus will help you do that. The other important idea is that Henry is very disconnected from life around him. But he's not the only character. Like, Catherine is quite disconnected from her life and from the people like Ferguson, who really tries to fight for her to make good choices about her life, but Catherine doesn't care. So, although we see Henry is very disconnected, there are other characters who are quite disconnected. And even there are times when Rinaldi seems disconnected. He talks about only liking 3 things. Fear is very much a part of the novel, but again, we have to infer most of the fear. It's not apparent trying to be masculine. I guess Henry, tries to downplay his fear and also downplay the fear of Catherine. There's grief throughout the novel. Catherine's grief is very real. Ferguson's grief is very real. And at the end, we get the first obvious grief when Catherine dies. And there's a sense of loyalty, the loyalty that Henry feels to his fellow soldiers and ambulance drivers, but also the loyalty that he feels toward Catherine herself, and the loyalty that Ferguson has to Catherine. Okay, so more detail. Henry seems to have very good ideas about what a real man should be, about how it is to be masculine. So Rinaldi is really an Italian, all fire and smoke and nothing inside. And that's, something that's quite admirable, to have nothing inside. You don't have real emotions. It's all about, enjoying life, being bigger than life. And that's how Rinaldi is. Men also operate on their own. So doctors who fail in the practice of medicine have a tendency to seek out one another's company. Sorry, there's a typo there. It's not about being individual, but seeking out someone else's company. And there's this, there we go. There's this idea that, that even though things are terrible, the war is terrible, come on, we'll both get drunk and be cheerful, so we'll just move on. And for Henry, part of being a man is being a soldier. So he feels a masquerader, he feels a deserter, he feels a criminal. All of these things he feels when he's not in civilian clothes. So he's quite disconnected from life. Even though he hates the war and thinks the war is pointless, it gives him identity as a man. Like, this is something to be proud of, this is something that he wants. Because clearly, he's seeking out a uniform in a country that he has nothing in common with except a language. So, being a soldier is an important part of being a man. The sense of hopelessness is very strong in Farewell to Arms. All of these quotes here are about, life being fairly pointless, and how, it doesn't matter how hard you fight or what you do, you're going to die in the end, so, why bother? The idea of the hopelessness of life is, of course, embodied by the war. So war is almost like a gigantic symbol for the pointlessness of life, because, the war is pointless. You fight, you die, all of these sorts of things. But you fight and you die even when you're away from war. So even when you're away from war, and especially when you're away from war, like it's when Henry's away from war that that Catherine becomes pregnant. So, life has started. It's when Henry's away from the war that Catherine dies. So whether or not you're in war, people get killed and life comes to an end in a horrible and traumatic way. And the death of Catherine is just as traumatic, for instance, as the death of Amo. So, life is pointless, and the war shows us exactly how pointless. As if life is not traumatic enough, people are actively trying to kill each other. So we get this, tremendous sense of hopelessness from Farewell to Arms. And because everything's hopeless, we have this feeling of disconnection. So one of the things that Henry really likes is he likes the darkness because, this sense of disconnection, the unreality of life is stronger and clearer. He sees, the love that he has for Catherine as being moves in a chess game, and everything that's happening around him when he's in pain. That quote from page 56: all that was happening was without interest or relation. He's in terrible pain, and all he can focus on is the pain, and the world and the war going on around him are completely meaningless. The sense of disconnection, of course, is heightened by the style of writing, and I've talked already about what happens in chapter 16. So we, as an audience, feel very disconnected from the action. Like the war, this idea of the horrors of war, we have to infer the horrors of war. When Amo dies, it's quite dry. It's raining physically, but Henry's description is dry. I was as fond of him as I was of anybody. When he has sex and the enema in chapter 16, as readers, we have to infer we're distant from it. We're not there with him, partly because Henry feels disconnected from everything going on around him. So we have to work hard to connect with what's going on. And that's one of the things I think students typically find very difficult about studying A Farewell to Arms, is that the writing very much echoes this disconnection with the action. A lot of the action, whenever he's having sex with Catherine, is, sort of between the lines. It's sort of blink and you'll miss it type action. And his grief is blink and you'll miss it. Catherine's grief is blink and you'll miss it. So there's this ongoing sense of disconnection by both the style of the writing and by what they say. Fear is there, but again, we have to infer what's going on. Henry always tries to downplay his fear, like he just feels the ridiculousness of carrying a pistol, this idea that the war is not dangerous, he's not afraid of what's going on. And instead, characters are afraid of something ridiculous like the rain. I've always been afraid of the rain. The rain is the only thing that people are afraid of, that Catherine is afraid of, when, of course, there are much realer things to be afraid of, much better things to be afraid of. So the rain symbolises this fear because they're afraid of, they're reluctant to discuss their actual fear of what's going on around them. And again, Catherine keeps banging on about, everybody has babies, it's a natural thing, I'm not worried, but I will drink beer because, the baby's quite big and I need to keep the size down, those sorts of things. So she's constantly coming back to this idea. She's not afraid, she will be brave, all of these sorts of things. There would be no need to be brave if she wasn't afraid. Grief is about the way they live their lives as well as for characters. So, Hemingway, but Henry as a character is always expressing grief that he's not doing what he intended to do. He never does the things that he wanted to do. So it's grief about the way he lives life, which seems so pointless and disconnected from the people around him, that he hadn't meant to treat Catherine so lightly, as well as the grief that he feels for Catherine. There's that quote about Amo and how he grieves for Amo, but in a very matter-of-fact way. Catherine has a lot of grief about the way she treated her fiancé, that she didn't sleep with him when he wanted her to, and she is so now she sort of tries to make up for it by living in each moment, and she uses Frederick Henry at the beginning very much as a substitute for her lover. So yeah, she uses Henry to express her grief. The sense of loyalty is really strong amongst the men. Part of Henry's feelings about wearing a uniform are connected to his feelings about being part of a unit, part of the men. And Rinaldi, says, "I'm very moved to see you so badly wounded." Clearly he's very loyal to Henry. But at the beginning, Henry is criticised for not sacrificing, not wanting to do things for his lover, for Catherine. He's got much more loyalty towards the men at the beginning, but that does shift. And towards the end, he realises that he can't lose any time with Catherine. He wants to be with Catherine, he wants to support her and do all these things. You also see loyalty in characters such as Helen Ferguson, who's very much trying to do the right thing by Catherine and for Catherine. She doesn't see that Henry is doing the right thing for her, and she's terribly worried about, Catherine's life and what's going to happen to her. And with good reason, of course. So we can see the loyalty not just with the men, but with Ferguson as well. So they're the main themes. Now I want to talk about the symbols that are in Farewell to Arms, and one of the things that I think is fantastic about A Farewell to Arms in terms of writing about it and in terms of answering a how question, like how is this shown, is the symbols are so clear and obvious. So that's a really terrific thing when you're studying a text to have such great symbols, I think. The first of the symbols is the rain. The rain is there whenever bad stuff is happening. Whenever something wrong happens, the sky is clouding over. Whenever, when Catherine, says she's pregnant, the sky is clouding over. When he deserts the army, it's raining. When Amo dies, it's raining. When they row the boat to Switzerland, it's raining. And when Catherine dies, guess what? It is raining. So, it's made even clearer because Catherine, of course, is afraid of the rain. So we really see that rain is central to our understanding of the fears of the characters. And at the end, when, Henry's all sort of, "God damn it, all to hell, I can't believe this has happened," and he seems as though he can't grieve properly, it's almost like the sky is grieving for him. The rain is symbolic of the grieving that's going on. It's symbolic of bad stuff. The seasons are also a terrific indicator of what's coming up and what's going to happen. So Henry's mood is generally reflected by the seasons, and the books themselves and the mood of the books is reflected in the seasons. So in the beginning, it's winter and things are sort of uncertain, but it's in book one, nothing much is happening. And it's the beginning of spring at the end of book one when he meets Catherine. So he begins to hope. Things are sort of looking up. And even though he's blown up eating cheese at this point, it's not a very tragic sense, I guess. This idea that love is blossoming and, he's got a regular shag and all those marvellous things is reflected by this idea of spring, the time of hope. In book two, it's summer. And, got the lazy days of summer where they sit around getting drunk and making love all the time and going to the races and eating well. And there's this real holiday feel. And, of course, even though you've got your exams coming up, they'll be over soon and you'll be on schoolies and there'll be all these marvellous ideas about, summer being a time of freedom and, endless days and fabulous things happening. And we very much see that in Farewell to Arms, that summer is when lovely things happen, long, lazy days. In book three, when Henry returns to the front, it's autumn. It's clouding over again, bad stuff is happening, Catherine is pregnant, the war is looking worse and worse, he has to desert the army, the weather is turning for the worse, days are shortening, things are looking bleaker, bad stuff is happening, and it's raining. So autumn, as the season turns, so does the mood of the novel. And, of course, as the autumn deepens towards winter, so in late autumn, they're fleeing into Switzerland. And then they spend most of Switzerland in, and it's winter, and of course when the ground is frozen, from Greek mythology, that during winter everything sleeps, and of course, death is sort of the big sleep. So winter is an absence of life because, all the leaves have fallen off the trees and all the animals have gone into hibernation. All of those sorts of things that happen in winter in the Northern Hemisphere sort of show us what's coming, that, of course, Catherine is going to die because, that's what happens in winter. Bad stuff happens and it's cold. Hunger and eating are tremendous symbols, as I've already alluded to earlier on. And, of course, drinking is very important. Henry describes himself often as feeling empty or hollow, and even more explicitly as hungry. But I think that this feeling of being empty and hollow was much more of an existential, a spiritual thing. But because Henry is very much a man who lives in the here and now, and has not much sympathy for spiritual ideas, he tries to fill this void that's within him, which you could describe as a spiritual void, or a lack of connection with life. So this constant feeling of emptiness he tries to fill with food, and especially drink. He's trying to get drunk all the time. He's trying to fill himself up, which of course is never going to happen because you can't fill a spiritual void with food. It's a visceral thing. The idea of food and drink being important is further indicated by the times of sorrow and danger when food and drink come to the fore. So, when he's blown up eating cheese, it's, he's eating cheese. He's blown up, he's eating cheese. He's trying to negate his fear and his sense of disconnection with food and drink. So this sort of thing is happening all the time. As I said, when he's deserting the army, he feels hungry, and he's eating when Catherine's in labour. So all of these things that are happening all the time, and the other men in the novel talk about, the war is hopeless, let's get drunk. And when he's in hospital and he's afraid of what's going to happen to his leg and he's afraid for his own health, he gets drunk a lot. And people come to visit him, oh my goodness, this terrible thing that's happened to you, they get drunk. So, food and drink is a really important symbol. The sense of foreboding is really strong in the novel, and, when you're talking about how is this done, the sense of foreboding is partially furnished by this idea of a 5-act tragedy, because 5 acts play out in a certain way, and anyone who's familiar with literature will know that, following these 5 acts, this is what's going to happen, which of course it does. What happens in this 5-act tragedy is not unlike what happens in Romeo and Juliet or other tragedies. So the sense of foreboding is in the very structure of the novel to begin with. There's also a sense of foreboding with both Catherine and Helen, who are very negative, and because, of course, the women tend not to get drunk, to forget or to distance themselves from what's going on, they're much more connected with, wow, bad stuff is going to happen. And Helen Ferguson, of course, predicts the tragic end of Catherine, and, Catherine has already herself predicted that she's going to die in the rain, which she does. So they both know what's coming, and Catherine, of course, knows what's coming because, we get this sense that she's terribly afraid of how the baby is going to be born. There are also pairs of images that you'll notice by the time you've read this novel 4 or 5 times. Excuse me, but not necessarily before. There are images of bats when they're entering rooms. When Henry and Catherine are together, there's bats that are sort of fluttering around, like, this image of darkness. There are also statues that occur in rooms, linking up the beginning and the end. And there's this idea of chess, so, the game of love at the beginning, and chess that Henry and Catherine play toward the end. So the beginning and the end of the novel are linked by those images. Catherine's hair is a really important symbol as well. Catherine's hair, I think, is almost vital to our understanding of Catherine, because he admires the beauty of her hair, and the light and the gold of her hair that are the complete antithesis to the darkness that he feels within him. He talks about, I love to take her hair down and we would both be inside of it, and it was the feeling of inside a tent or behind falls. So that really shows us, I think, how Catherine is an escape for Henry. She, she symbolises an escape from the outside world. As I said earlier, her hair shines. It's this feeling of light. She's blonde, and he gets this feeling of light that sort of protects him from the darkness that's around and the darkness that is within him. And remember, at night time, he feels himself disconnected from the world and that things are all unreal around him. So Catherine's hair very much represents the woman herself, that she is an escape from, and she helps him shut out the horrors around him. And it represents the light that she brings into his life, which is otherwise dark and horribly hopeless. Okay, I've come to the end of the formal part of the presentation. If you've got any questions, Sam, please type them in and I'll answer them. Otherwise, good luck on your exam, and I hope it all goes fabulously.